This video will be looking at continuing with this idea of Mendelian genetics and simple recessive and dominant disorders, particularly in this video, then also first talking about this concept of a pedigree and using that concept to kind of talk about some of the disorders that we're going to look at. And so pedigree is basically a family tree of sorts, but it is particular in that it represents the passing of particular traits through generations. And so you think about pedigree, usually you hear the word associated with like animals, and a dog has a particular pedigree that just means that he or she has that trait that has been passed down, if it's a particular breed or whatever. And so here's a pedigree for a dominant trait like widow's peak. And it just shows individuals. There are particular things that you can look at with a pedigree. The squares are male, the circles are female, and the colored in shapes are represent that they have the trait that's being looked at. And so here's a dominant trait, and so you can see which ones are colored in. That one makes a lot of sense. Here's a recessive trait pedigree, same sort of thing. And so a lot of times what you'll be looking at with a pedigree is he may be asked to fill in blanks in a pedigree or something like that, just based off what you know about simple Mendelian genetics sort of principles, doing these simple sorts of crosses to understand them. Nothing too hard here. Now we're going to look at some recessive disorders. Before we look at recessive disorders, I want to go back, understand, and so this is just looking at attached earlobes, but a recessive disorder is something that is expressed when, obviously, like any other expressive or recessive trait, only when two recessives. Both of these parents, if let's say that this was a cystic fibrosis pedigree, both of these parents would be considered carriers of cystic fibrosis. They don't actually have the disease because dominant in this case is quote unquote normal, but so they don't have it, but they are both able to pass it. So they are considered carriers. And usually that is in the heterozygous situation like this, that is the term that is used for it when you're talking about a disorder of some kind. And then they have a possibility of some of their offspring having the disorder. And so cystic fibrosis is an example of a recessive disorder. It is common in about 1 in 2,500 births, and whereas around 1 in 25 people is a carrier. So you can kind of do some of the math there. Basically, what happens with cystic fibrosis is there is a mutation on a protein. I think it's just a couple of base pairs, really simple sort of thing. And whereas a healthy cell has this protein that works and allows the passage of chlorine ions, which allows the fluid to be at equilibrium, the mutant channel is closed. Remember, shape determines function. Shape is determined by the amino acids. If the amino acids are broken, the shape is broken. And this shape is broken because the amino acids are bad because of a mutation. And so the chlorine is not able to get through the channel. So there's a buildup of mucus on the outside of the cells. And this isn't good in the lungs. And so that's essentially what's going on with cystic fibrosis. Understand this about a genetic disorder. There's no cure for them because every single cell of the body has this mutation in it. The only cure would be to replace those cells in the lungs or replace that DNA in those cells. And so that is where current cure-related things are headed. But there are ways to treat these kinds of disorders, treating the symptoms rather than obviously curing the disease. Another example of a recessive disorder is called Taysachs disease. Essentially what happens here is you have non-functioning lysosomes in nerve cells, and those lysosomes are needed to break down fat and are just a certain sort of molecule that is basically a big lipid, and it doesn't break down that lipid, so those lipids build up in the nerve cells, thereby destroying them. And this typically happens around 6 months to a year of life, and the individual will slowly lose function over time because their brain is basically just being kind of choked out by this fat. One interesting thing about this is that it is found in particular populations around the world that tend to intermarry don't typically marry outside of their own demographic. And so those populations have a higher incidence of Tay-Sachs than the rest of the population. Sickle cell anemia is another type of recessive disorder. It is about 1 in 400 births, but it does tend to occur in certain populations more so than others. It is typically associated with the Black population, and this has to do with their ancestry. And the reason for that is because sickle cell is a benefit in some parts of the world, like Africa, where malaria is very common. And because people who have sickle cell have resistance to malaria. We'll get into that a little bit in a second. But basically, you can see here, there is a mutation on one of those, one of the amino acids, and it causes some significant issues. Basically, what goes on with sickle cell is that the genes, or that the red blood cells, are shaped oddly, and so they can't get through the blood vessels as well as they would be able to otherwise. And so this causes blood vessels to be clogged, which reduces the ability to carry oxygen and those sorts of things. Again, there's treatment for this sort of thing, but there's no cure because it is a genetic disorder. Now, this idea of people who have sickle cell being resistant to malaria is one thing. People who don't have sickle cell aren't resistant, and so they can get malaria. Malaria is a much more deadly thing in certain parts of the world. And so, interestingly enough, this population has developed malaria, or has developed this particular disease, and has stuck around because it is more favorable than catching malaria. I know that sounds really crazy. One thing that's interesting is heterozygous individuals that have one dominant trait, so they don't have cystic fibrosis, but have one recessive trait, so they're carriers of it. Those heterozygous individuals actually have resistance to sickle cell, or to malaria, excuse me, but also don't have the traits of sickle cell. And so that is called a heterozygous advantage, where they don't have the disease and they also can't get malaria. And so this is an example of a heterozygous advantage, where the homozygous dominant trait is bad, the homozygous recessive trait is not good either, but the heterozygous trait is the most beneficial. And so individuals in these populations typically favor this heterozygous position more than others. So moving on to dominant disorders, some disorders are only present with a dominant trait, and so the vast majority of the population have homozygous recessive alleles for both of those, or for that disorder. Achondroplasia is an example of this. 1 in around 10,000 births have this achondroplasia, which is just genetic dwarfism. And people who are homozygous dominant, or who are dominant for this disorder, have dwarfism. The most of the population, of course, has homozygous recessive. And so someone who shows dwarfism has the dominant allele, and depending on whether they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous, may or may not pass that on to the next generation. Same thing with Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is around 1 in 10,000 as well. One thing that's difficult about Huntington's disease is it is a neuro disorder, that neurodegenerative, meaning like your nerve system or nervous system degenerates slowly, but it doesn't start showing up until later in life, usually after those individuals have had children. And so Huntington's disease, it's important to know kind of the family history and know the risks associated with having children who have this. It's a slow kind of degenerative disease, and it's almost always fatal. So nowadays, where there's more being done about knowledge and pre-testing and that sort of thing, but this used to be a more dangerous sort of thing. Now, a couple of other things here to talk about when it comes to things like Huntington's disease in particular are these two ideas of penetrance and expressivity. Penetrance is the idea that there is a proportion of individuals in a group of a given genotype that will actually show the expected phenotype. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's pretend that this BB is Huntington's disease. All right, big B is Huntington's, little b is normal. Some individuals that are big B, or big B, little b will actually have Huntington's. Some of them will not. Even though they have the allele for the disorder, they will never have it. And so, meaning that you think about it this way, the word penetrance has to do with like penetrate. And so the trait is, or the expression of that gene has not penetrated, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. It hasn't been fully expressed. Now, this idea of expressivity has to do with the degree at which an individual expresses the disorder. So here you see variable penetrance. Some people aren't going to have it, some people are. Something like Huntington's, about 5% of the population doesn't express it if they have the allele. Expressivity means that some people's Huntington's is worse than others. So this individual expresses it, but it's not nearly as bad as this individual who also expresses it. This is really common in genetic disorders. A person who has, cystic fibrosis one person may live into their 30s. Another person may die really early on because they just have a varying expressivity. And so one important thing to talk about with genetic disorders is not only just whether or not an individual has it, but to what degree they express that as well.